Allegations of voter fraud and voter intimidation surface in one Illinois county. We'll talk about that next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues and Illinois Public Radio. And joining us today is Brian Mackey with Illinois Public Radio. Brian, glad you're here.
Thanks for having me, Jamey.
And Bruce Rushton with the Illinois Times. Bruce, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Brian, we've had some kind of interesting stories come out this week. Not sure what all is going on, but there's some allegations that there have maybe been voter fraud and possibly voter intimidation as well in Kankakee County, Illinois, which is a northern Illinois county. What's going on there? Yeah,
Kankakee County is about the first sort of major metropolitan area south of Chicago, due south of Chicago, that's not part of the suburbs, really. And it's the state's attorney there put out a press release earlier this week saying he was opening an unprecedented investigation into allegations of vote buying. And basically and there have been no charges filed or any sort of legal proceedings initiated other than his internal or his investigation. But what the allegations were is that some people were coming down and apparently promising gifts or money for votes in order to vote for Hillary Clinton and the Democratic state legislative candidate in that race, Kate Clunan. We should point out that that has been one of the most competitive districts. The Democrats didn't really expect to win it 4 years ago. When she did, she won by a little more than 100 votes in one election. The next time around, and I may have them backwards, but it was about 100 votes each time. And that is incredibly close when you think of thousands of votes being cast in these races. So that's from the Republican state's attorney there. Same day, some local Democratic poobahs come out and say that they've heard sort of counter problems, that the sheriff's department is stationing people at the early voting location in the county, and that the county clerk is giving people a hard time and perhaps demanding identification that is not a requirement under Illinois law. So long story short, we still don't know a lot. It's sort of a he said at this point between Republicans and Democrats. One thing that did happen later in the week, though, is that Attorney General Lisa Madigan and Jim Lewis, the U.S. Attorney for the Central District of Illinois here, where Kankakee is a part of, paid a visit to the county officials there to sort of talk to them about both sides. Their news release did emphasize this question of voter intimidation and access to the polls, and that you can't really block people or try and intimidate them by having police officers giving people hard glares as they go in to cast their ballots.
Well, and Bruce, we saw in the primary races, some of the more contested primary races, these kinds of rumors of vote buying and
I think there were more than rumors. I mean, they had video, but.
But I mean, this doesn't really come as a surprise in this tight of a race and how much money is flowing in.
Let's back this up just a second. If Inspector Clouseau has a criminal case, does Inspector Clouseau put out a press release saying, "I suspect this"? No, Inspector Clouseau keeps his mouth shut until he's actually got a case. And so I can't understand why they would be putting out a press release at this point in time when they haven't made a case. Now, if there's a bona fide thing where folks are being intimidated, that's one thing. But vote, and they're actually, I think I have read some news accounts where that seems to have a few more legs in this somewhat nebulous story about voter fraud. But you putting out a press release is kind of odd. The state's attorney, my understanding, didn't fare well in a recent election in which he was judged by his brethren on the bar. I think they do a bar bench.
He was running for judge.
Judge, yes, thank you. And so I mean, so you got to consider the source here a little bit. I mean, I don't mean to dump on the Kankakee state's attorney, whoever he might be, but I'd have a lot more thinking about this if this came down from Oliver Wendell Holmes or somebody who's got a proven legal track record with wide respect by their peers. So far, we've got a press release that kind of came out of nowhere with no specific allegations, other than they're going to stop passing out "I voted" stickers.
Right.
The thought being that people were basically
who's going to vote
giving
if you can't
money
get a sticker,
if you gave them your sticker.
Well, yeah, the idea is here is that
votes.
is that you can come out and give and they buy the sticker from
Correct.
you, right? So one thing that I think is worth keeping in mind here is that early voting is a big deal now. I think it was 20% in the last election here in Illinois, and I can only imagine that number is going to be higher this time around. When you hear people talk about how is the candidate's ground game, House Speaker Madigan and the Democrats have a big ground game. And in a district like this, that means identifying people who are perhaps in areas that are likely to vote Democratic, but maybe are not going to be as motivated to go to the polls without a ride or some encouragement. And so this is what the ground game takes the form of. People will go, and they have databases now, and they can go knock on people's doors, or maybe they go to a nursing home or something. They offer people a ride. They're not supposed to say, hey, if you vote Democrat, I'll give you a ride to the polls, but that's the sort of idea.
I'll give you a ride back.
But you're going to, so I mean, this is something that is, it's important for parties to do this. But you're right, this question about putting out a press release was curious. Rich Miller, the blogger and newsletter publisher of Capitol Facts, he reported, if you look at the metadata, and I didn't recognize the name, I looked at it myself, that apparently a former Kankakee County Republican official had been one of the people who reviewed the document, the press release, before it went out, which is interesting, and it's coincidental, I'm sure, that the Illinois Republican Party was ready to set up a voter fraud hotline within 24 hours, I think, in order to get reports. And this is, of course, something that has become a big partisan talking point. People who want to restrict voting by requiring IDs, or I should say, people who want to require IDs for voting, which is not the law in Illinois right now. You don't need to show an ID to vote. But people who have argued for that here and elsewhere say that there's an epidemic of voter fraud. But the evidence has been that there is very little voter fraud out there. These cases are few and far between.
But it's such a hot and heavy topic these days, particularly given what's happened with the Democratic Convention and the hacking that went on. I think it's on people's radar screen, perhaps to an extent it may never have been before, and it's been on people's radar screen for a long time. I would like to be a fly on the wall when Jim Lewis and Lisa Madigan had a talk with or spoke with the Kankakee State's attorney, because if he didn't have solid evidence, I could imagine that the conversation might have been a bit pointed, because it's a very serious allegation, and it has very serious potential repercussions. And to just throw something like that out there, and if it's been reviewed by by somebody in a partisan position, that's starting to look a little ugly and stinky.
Well, and as you said, Brian, everyone's ground games are really stepped up this year because there's a lot of money sloshing around. Part of the Republican ground game can often be poll watchers or people who are kind of hanging out, making sure there isn't any voter fraud going on. Some people say that borders on intimidation, but as long as they're following the rules, it's perfectly within bounds. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on as far as the Republican side on money? We've seen a lot of money come in various campaigns and then kind of move from one person to another, and it's been kind of interesting to watch.
Yeah, it's both the Republican and the Democratic side, really. That Illinois has theoretically contribution caps, but there are these relief valves built in. The idea being a few years ago when we finally, because Illinois used to be a sort of Wild West, the idea was you could donate any amount, but it had to be disclosed at least. Well, now we have caps, and money will find a way. It always does. And so what's happened now is you have a wealthy candidate. So in the case of the special election for controller, Leslie Munger is pretty wealthy. She and her husband, I believe, gave her campaign a lot of money, and that blew the caps off. Initially, that was intended to be a safety valve so that if you were a plucky upstart running against a rich person, you would be able to mount your own defense. But what that's allowed is that, so Munger has blown the caps off. Now Ken Griffin, the richest man in Illinois, according to those rankings by Forbes and others, and Dick Uihlein, who runs a big cardboard box packing material company, very wealthy men, very tightly aligned with Governor Bruce Rauner, gave her a lot of money. She then shifted that money over to the state Republican Party, and that can now be spread around. What we're seeing is that people are finding ways to work within the law. We see, and we're seeing it on the Democratic side too, a lot of money being shifted here and there so that people are being adequately funded, but they're having to scramble and do a lot of weird T crossing and I dotting, and maybe T dotting and I crossing in order to get it done.
Well, and Bruce, when these regulations passed, I mean, there was definitely warning that these things would happen, and this was all, talked about when they talked about a way to take the limits off. That people are going to find a way to do this.
Illinois isn't. I mean, there are very, very few states that have gotten serious caps on that have stuck. I think Vermont might be one where that's actually stuck. We're not living in Vermont. Come on. And so, everybody knew this sort of thing was going to happen, and it should come as a surprise to nobody. It's in nobody's interests, I think, either on the Madigan camp or the Rauner camp, to have some serious reforms so that you can remove the caps, because they're in charge, and if they need the money, it'll come from somebody.
And I think that it's just important to get the perspective here that you could be an individual candidate and spend 80 hours a week calling everybody you know and everybody in the phone book, trying to scrape together donation after donation after donation. And somebody like Bruce Rauner has so much money, and if he chooses to bless a certain candidate that's your opponent, he can just write a check, and and that goes through the party apparatus, and all that work of fundraising can immediately be equaled out. Now, right now, the two sides in Illinois are pretty fairly matched, and ultimately there's only so much money you can spend on television advertising. There are only so many, 30-second slots in before
There's so much time in a day, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean...
And it already feels like they're pretty full of
and
advertising.
And they are, and that's what happens
Netflix.
is that... Political scientists will tell you, as long as both sides reach a certain adequacy of funding and it's not a huge mismatch, then ultimately the money begins to not matter that much. I mean, look, Governor Rauner outspent Pat Quinn 2-1. I think it was $60 million to $30 million, ballpark figures. And he still only won by 5 points. So the money will get you to a certain level, and it certainly is making the Republicans a lot more competitive this year than they might otherwise have been.
And that plays out locally too. I mean, in the primary last spring, McCann versus Benton, money didn't matter. They were both well-funded candidates, and they reached that level. And the governor's money past a certain point didn't matter. The Bourne-Mathis race is another example of money, a local race that's just attracting tons and tons and tons of money. It'll be interesting to see you could actually go back and do the math on the 1,000-plus contribution limits. There are dozens upon dozens upon dozens for each campaign. But Bourne had something like $125,000 on hand, and that was as of the end of July, and has been amassing money from the party. And others ever since. And Mathis has also been doing a great deal of fundraising. So it's playing out locally. I haven't looked as much on the 99th race, but I imagine the same thing is true.
Well, if you're following the presidential race, it seems like new polling comes out every few days, but state-level polling is a little harder to come by. Brian, a pretty major poll from the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute came out recently, and I believe you had a story that all the party leadership, both Democrat and Republican, have something in common. Nobody likes them. Can you tell us a little bit about how everyone polled and how that affects the election, even though they're not running?
Yeah, they're not. Their name, House Speaker Madigan's name is on the ballot, and 1 in 118 Illinoisans will have the opportunity to vote for him because he's just in one district. But Governor Rauner's not on the ballot this time, but certainly we see Democrats trying to tie their opponents to Governor Rauner, and we've seen Republicans trying to tie Democrats to House Speaker Michael Madigan through a lot of creative means, like photoshopping them in sheep's clothing, listening to, or being puppets that the speaker is pulling their strings. It turns out that they are all dramatically unpopular. There's this amazing chart that shows they're all underwater. That's the term pollsters use, which means that more people think they're doing a bad job than think they're doing a good job. That's true for House Speaker Michael Madigan, a Democrat, Senate President John Cullerton, a Democrat, and Governor Bruce Rauner, a Republican, obviously. One of the more interesting findings in this result, I thought, is that Senate President Cullerton is not faring quite as badly as the other two candidates in terms of how lopsided his ratings are, but that's mostly because a lot of voters just don't know who he is or don't have an opinion of him. His name has not been dragged into the campaigns nearly as much as this effort to, quote unquote, fire Madigan. Of course, Michael Madigan has been Speaker of the Illinois House for all but 2 years since 1983, and that's made him a big target for Republicans.
Well, a little hyperbole there. Of course, some people like them, but just not nearly
No, yeah, they
as
have
many as they would hope.
But it's basically a quarter of the voters approve of Madigan and Cullerton. And even in Chicago, you'd think where that's kind of their home base. They're both from Chicago. They both represent areas of Chicago. Even in Chicago, they call it crosstabs, I think. Their polling numbers were not great. Only 31% of people in Chicago approve of Madigan. Only 30% of people in Chicago approve of Cullerton. Rauner remarkably even had a little better approval rating in the Chicago city, which was 34%.
Well, and Bruce, it's not really surprising because Madigan and Rauner are really bloodying each other in this battle over the budget, right? I mean, they're just
they're not
beating up on each other every day.
Well,
when they talk.
that's stopped though.
Yeah.
They haven't been bloodying each other directly since June or July now, and so it's almost like a timeout from the bloodying on this stage, so we can go bloody each other on multiple other stages throughout the. But yeah, I mean, they're clearly these Rauner and Madigan are both being used as stand-in/puppets for pick a candidate. This is just Madigan in disguise. This is just Rauner in disguise. I mean, it's playing itself out in race after race after race after race, and so it's a theme that you almost don't see any other theme. And at some point, I think voters are going to get overloaded with it if they're not already. I mean, it's an election season where you're not seeing. I mean, it's hard to say, but when you see the numbers that Brian just showed us, it just seems like there's a big lack of enthusiasm for government in the state of Illinois. Nobody really seems to, like either side.
And really nationally at this
point. Yeah, no. And just one more point on Governor Rauner and Madigan. I think where maybe it will start to matter at some point here is that unlike House Speaker Madigan, who he is a sort of boogeyman but does not actually have to run statewide, Bruce Rauner has said he wants to run for re-election, and in 2 years he's going to have to do so. And so you've got to imagine that with his popularity rating hovering at 40%, as long as the Democrats field somebody who is at least somewhat attractive to Illinois voters, that Governor Rauner is going to want to work hard to drive those numbers up a little bit.
Well, and that poll also asked voters about their opinion of a proposed constitutional amendment that if you're going to the polls or if you've already gone, you'll see before you. Brian, I feel like a lot of folks, when I talk to people about this amendment, aren't even necessarily aware that it's going to be on the ballot. Can you tell us a little bit about what the question is that's going to appear before voters on their ballot?
Yeah, basically there is a constitutional amendment which has been approved by the House and the Senate here in Illinois, and the last step before it would become enshrined in the Illinois Constitution is that the voters have to approve it. And it basically asks whether money that's collected from the gasoline tax, tolls, license plate fees, other transportation fees, which are, the idea is that they're supposed to be spent on roads, bridges, transportation projects, that sort of thing. And this would, if you remember the 2000 election, Al Gore liked to talk about a lockbox for Social Security. This is called the transportation lockbox. It would basically say if this money is collected from the gasoline tax, tolls, license plates, it has to be used on bridges, transportation funding. As you know, legislators have often treated fees as fungible and just part of the general state budget. They do what's called sweeping. Even though these monies go into distinct funds, they get repurposed for the kind of day-to-day operations of state government, be it prisons or veterans' homes or what have you.
And what did respondents to this poll have to say about that? It's pretty widely supported, right?
Yeah, it was, I believe the Simon Institute people said this was one of the highest things they had ever polled. It came in at 80% in favor of it. Excuse me, that was the wrong, 79, I guess, yeah. It's about 80% in favor of it, only 13% opposed. It was more popular downstate than in Chicago, as you would expect. Downstate is a bigger consumer of transportation money. Obviously, there's just more miles of road downstate that people have to travel on. So it was exceedingly popular. Nevertheless, the supporters of this, who are a perhaps unlikely coalition of business and labor, who the businesses want the money to build the roads and the labor wants the jobs operating the heavy equipment and pouring the asphalt and so forth. They're both coming together to support it. They're going to have a TV advertising campaign. So barring something unexpected, it seems like this thing is going to sail to passage.
Well, and there's something to be said for spending the money that is collected through taxes on what the state said it was going to spend it on, and there's been court cases, over this, and fund sweeps have been upheld. But Bruce, how would this affect budgeting in the future if we see something like this get, enshrined in the Constitution? Like, no, you can't touch this money.
Well, I think it's remarkable, frankly, that the legislature passed it, because it does, not so much the legislature as the governor paints him into a tighter corner, but really paints everybody into a tighter corner. I mean, this is one of the largest, piggy banks out there that you can use to, okay, we can raid/sweep a few funds to get us through the next election, and then we'll pass a real budget, that sort of thing. But this takes a huge amount of money off the table, makes budgeting that much more difficult in a time where budgeting is already difficult. I don't think, obviously, it's going to affect the quote-unquote impasse that's on, I guess, pause right now. When that starts up again, this is, I don't, they're not going to sweep this transportation funds as part of a permanent budget. I would hope they wouldn't. It's the sort of thing you see as a stopgap measure. And so it's good news, I guess, in one respect, is that perhaps it might force politicians and the state government to be a bit more responsible fiscally down the road and not play as many games as they have in the past.
Although one of the issues, I think, is that there is so much distrust in Springfield among the Republican governor and the Democrats who control the legislature at present that I can't imagine they're going to be able to spend this money on capital projects, because capital projects are a big sort of opportunity for deal making, and at least they have been in the past, handshake agreements, and you support me on this and we'll get a bridge you've been asking for in your district, or we'll build that new expressway you want in your area. And the governor and the Democrats seem to have so little trust right now, it's hard to imagine that they would be able to come together to agree how to spend this money. So I kind of wonder where we might have this pool building up and might have a hard time spending it. I don't know. The other issue I have is, as Bruce pointed out, this is a big pile of money that's now taken off the table again. We've seen this with pensions. People have complained for years now that we have basically automatic pension payments go out before the rest of the budget even really comes together. And this is just adding something else to that. So the pool of money that legislators have to address the priority of state government. Some people might say that education is more important than road building. Some people might say that having safe prisons and the state police patrolling our roads is more important than road building. This decision is going to be off the table if this constitutional amendment comes. Road building will be more important every year by default in the Constitution, because legislators won't be able to say, well, this year we need to prioritize education, or this year we need to prioritize prisons.
It's more important really than law enforcement. You could raid a law enforcement fund. You couldn't raid a fund to build a bicycle trail. So,
Yeah.
Well, I want to cover just a little bit more election news. We've been following David Gill's battle to try to get on the ballot for the, is it 13th or 14th Congressional District? 13th,
13.
Right? And Brian, you've been covering some of that. It's been a court battle, and it seems he has lost it. He's not going to be on the ballot. But what was at stake there? What was the argument that he was trying to make to try to get on the ballot?
Yeah, David Gill, the man who sent phalanx of reporters to the dictionary to look up how to spell quixotic, because he has run, this is his, I believe, his 5th run for Congress. He's run as a Democrat 4 times before. This time he decided to go as an independent, which means you don't have to run in the primary. You can just fast petition signatures to run in the general. Illinois legislators, in their wisdom, have seen fit to make it much harder to run as an independent. The precise number is escaping me, but I think it's something like 15 times the number of signatures you had to gather. So if you wanted to run as the Democrat or the Republican in the 13th Congressional District, you had to do, I think it was about 700 something signatures. An independent, like David Gill this time around, had to file, I believe it was more than 11,000 signatures or 10,000 signatures. And so he challenged that in court. He had been denied getting on the ballot. It found that a number of his signatures were not valid. He brought a federal case and actually won at the trial court level. Federal District Court Judge Sue Myerscough here in Springfield, who incidentally has run for office herself as an elected Illinois judge, and knows what it's like to pass petitions and how grueling and difficult that can be, ruled that this was an unconstitutional burden on a candidate. And so she filed that. The Attorney General had sought to uphold the law and asked for a stay of that order, and it was granted. And Gill pursued at the Seventh Circuit Appellate Court in Chicago, and even went to 2 different Supreme Court justices in Washington to try and restore that trial court order, and was unsuccessful in doing so. So he finally, just this week, said, okay, I'm giving up the ghost. I'm not going to run for election this time. But he is still going to try and press this case to make it easier for independents to get on the ballot in Illinois.
I mean, he did remarkably well. Even I think he got in excess of 8,000 signatures, something like that.
That was the valid number.
The valid number.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, even to get that number of signatures is a major accomplishment. And I think this raises some serious questions, or head scratchers at least, about Lisa Madigan. Why did she appeal Myers-Koff's decision? She wasn't bound to do that. And she could have said, she's bound to defend state law, although she's also failed to do that prior, at least with the issue of gay marriage. She said, I'm not going to defend that because I don't think it's constitutional. Okay, fine. But in this case, she did her duty as the Attorney General. She, defended state law at the trial court level, lost, and then appeals. Why? Because I'm just hard pressed to think of a better case for opening up democracy than David Gill's case. He lost just by a whisker the last time he ran. Tens of thousands of people have voted for this man, and they're being denied the opportunity because the Attorney General thought that it was important to appeal this decision that the trial court, I think, reached. And if, in fact, this gets reversed again, then what do you say to the people of the 13th district that were denied this choice? What do you say to, because clearly this is likely going to help the Republican candidate if he had run. His entering the race had the potential at least to have a huge impact. His track record was such that it's hard to argue he shouldn't be on the ballot, and I think Lisa Madigan has some questions to answer about it.
Well, and we just have about a minute left, but Bruce, I want to touch on some non-election related news. The numbers came out for the state's medical marijuana program recently. Yeah, can you let us know what's going on there? It looks like the numbers are improving a little bit since legislation was passed.
Yeah, they've improved dramatically in the last couple months or so. Since they've loosened the law a bit. It's not so onerous anymore. They're up to 11,000 cards, and that's folks who have the ability to legally buy marijuana. The folks that I have spoken with inside the industry say that the make or break point is 20,000 cards. And so they're a bit more than halfway to what the insiders are saying, they're not insiders in a bad way, this is their industry, they presumably know it. They're saying that if we get 20,000 cards, we can make it in Illinois. They're at 11,000, and so, it's looking promising for them.
And we'll have to leave it at that. I'd like to thank my guests, Brian Mackey and Bruce Rushton. And I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.